Hello, if you're joining us, we're going to give folks a couple minutes here before we get started, so hang tight. Just going to give us about one more minute to start. Alrighty, welcome to this virtual event from the Strada Education Network. I'm Paul Fain, longtime higher ed journalist, now covering connections between education and work with a newsletter called The Job. I'm going to get right into this. So as many of you, or I assume probably all of you know, US college enrollment is declining. It's been declining for more than a decade. It's down to 16 million students in this country from a peak of 21 million in 2011, right after the Great Recession. Those drops accelerated dramatically in the pandemic and have not yet begun to slow. For example, undergraduate enrollment was down 4.7% this spring, and community colleges dropped by almost 8%. The two-year sector has had drops that are the most in 50 years. Yet, respondents to surveys from Strada say their likelihood to enroll is increasing. At the same time, however, confidence in the benefits of additional education is down. So we're going to try to get at that disconnect first with a presentation from Nicole Torpey-Sabo, Director of Research for the Strada Education Network. Then we'll turn to a discussion with three expert panelists. They are, and I'm not reading their full laurels here, just names and title, Debra Bragg, a fellow for community college with New America's Center for Education and Labor, Dominic Cobb, Director of the Office of Minority Student Affairs and TRIO programs at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Andrea Rodriguez, Director of the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, APLU. Thanks very much to our speakers for joining us. Nicole, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. As Paul alluded to, we will be talking about some more of the bad news on enrollment, but we're not just going to stick to that. We're also going to talk about some hopeful things that we're seeing in our data. And then I think more importantly with the data and then with the panelists talking about how to move from hope and opportunity into a reality for how we can help millions more students. So, sorry. There we go. All right. So as Paul said, and as you all are well aware, we've continued to see declining enrollment, and it has been declining since 2011, but even more so during the pandemic. We've lost more than 1 million students from higher education. And most of all, what you'll see is those green bars on the top there, the community colleges. Those have been hit the hardest. And we know from, everything we've read about the pandemic that these are the students who were hit the hardest in terms of health disparities and work as well as education. And so we need to be worried about this because these are students who were in the most precarious situations and have been the most disrupted. So when we're thinking about what we might expect for the coming fall, we're looking at these Fafsa data, and we see kind of mixed news here. So on the one hand, we see that total filings are down about 9% overall. We see renewals are down even more, down 12%, and renewals for Pell eligible applicants are down almost 16%. So this is really concerning. Again, we see a lot of the most vulnerable students not filling out these financial aid forms, which is a sign that they may not be continuing. At the same time, there is some opportunity. There's some reason for hope. So if you look on the left side here, we do see that for the class of 2022, the high school class, FAFSA filings are actually up from last year, and then up even more for students from low-income high schools. We know that those had taken a huge hit, but we do see some reason for potential optimism coming up. The thing is, we just can't forget, even if the numbers were to come back up, we've still lost a couple of years of students who never enrolled at all or who maybe are stopping out. And so we need to think about not only what can we do for the graduating high school seniors, but what can we do to bring back the students who either never enrolled or did stop out during this time. So what we're going to do is take a look now at what we are hearing from learners through our survey research, what they're telling us about their expectations around enrolling, what they're telling us about how they perceive the value of education. And we're also going to be able to look at how those two factors may predict their actual enrollment behavior. So what we have some trend lines, but then we also have surveys across 2 different time periods. So we're going to look at some research we did to recontact students or prospective learners that we had surveyed earlier and see who actually did go on to enroll. So the first thing we see, this is a little bit of reason for optimism. This is the self-reported likelihood to enroll of adults 18 to 65. So first we saw a big drop from 2019 to 2020, but we've actually been seeing that come back up. So between spring 2020 and then fall 2021, that's the last one we had on this, actually more people are saying that they are likely to enroll in education in the next 5 years. There you can see that it's rebounded just about to where it was, but we know that we haven't seen that yet in the actual enrollment numbers. So maybe it's coming. This is just one indicator. Also, when we're looking at who says they're most likely to enroll, here we see some opportunities. So we see young people, not surprisingly, being more likely to say that they will enroll compared to the general population. We see Black respondents and also those who had some college but didn't complete a degree or credential being more likely to say that they're going to enroll in future education. So again, here are the opportunities, and then let's not forget about the rest. So the older students, why are they not saying they will enroll, and what might we do to take down barriers and make things a little easier for them? So the question is, does that stated likelihood to enroll actually predict enrollment? And we found that it somewhat does. So these are the 2 different, we looked at 2 different periods in time, and people who said they were likely to enroll, about 1 in 6 actually had gone on to enroll when we followed up with them. And, they said they would enroll within the next 5 years. So it's not even been 5 years since the first survey. So, we do see about 1 in 6 had already gone on to enroll, which is a lot higher than those who didn't think that they would. So we do see that it's somewhat predictive, but it's not the whole story. So the next thing that we want to look at is these value perceptions. And as Paul alluded to, those have not been trending in a positive direction. So what we've seen here, we asked some questions about whether people thought that future education would advance their career. That's down 13 percentage points. Whether it would help them to get a stable job, it's down 9 percentage points. And whether additional education would be worth the cost. And that one has really plummeted, down 18 percentage points just since spring of 2020. And I've been reading, it feels like every other day, open up another survey or another study that's kind of corroborating this and, showing similar sentiments of people just having a lot of doubts or worries about whether their education is going to help them and, whether it would indeed be worth the cost. We know, empirically that, on average, higher education is a terrific investment, right? But we have to think about how can we make sure that those benefits are realized equitably and that people have the confidence that, it is a good investment for them. So when we look at these together, which one predicts is more predictive of whether people actually enroll, we actually see it's both. So I'll just take a second to kind of explain what we were trying to convey here. So this is looking at whether people said they were likely to enroll and whether they said education was worth the cost. So if they said both of those things, then they're in the upper right-hand corner, and about a third of those people actually did go on to enroll. If they just said one or the other, so if they said they were likely to enroll but didn't think it would be worth it, only about 10% actually did enroll. And then people who didn't think they would enroll, but they still had a positive perception about whether education is worth the cost, actually 14% of those people did go on to enroll in education. So we see that, you know, both of these, it's not just your expectations about your behavior, but kind of this, this perception of the value and the benefits of education does actually seem to correlate with enrollment behavior. So we need to pay attention to why those sentiments are down and what we can do to give people more confidence in the value of education. All right, so our last section here, we're going to talk about what we're hearing from learners in terms of what would help make things easier for them to enroll, what would take away their barriers, and what would give them more confidence in the value of additional education. So the first thing is looking at what are the biggest challenges. We keep asking this question in different ways, keep following up. You know, Paul has reported on this before this, and these top two are pretty consistent. You know, people say that cost is a barrier, but also time. You know, balancing school with work, with caretaking, with all kinds of other responsibilities is said to be either extremely or very challenging for about half of these prospective students. And then there's also a lot of these kind of emotional, maybe more intangible factors. So stress and anxiety was listed as very or extremely challenging for about 40%. Also close behind was just fear of not succeeding in education. Also, you know, close to that 40% mark. And then just some uncertainty about the job market or about what kind of educational path would be best. So we see there's both kind of the factors that we might think of most, like the money or even time, but then also some of these factors around, you know, stress, anxiety, confidence that we need to be thinking about. So when we asked people what would make them, you know, more likely to enroll, I'm going to talk about 5 things that really rose to the top. So the first ones really mirror what we saw on the previous page about their challenges. So a flexible schedule was listed by 56% of people. Credit for prior learning, which kind of touches on both the time and the money aspects of getting more education, because you can, you know, save time and money by getting credit for that prior learning. Financial aid, so again, addressing the cost barrier. But then these last two were more about kind of that confidence that education is going to lead to something. So 41% said better access to hands-on work-based learning would make them extremely or very likely to enroll. And then about 40% said if they had confidence that education would advance their career, then that would make them extremely or very likely to enroll. So again, kind of, you know, some of those factors that we've been talking about for a long time, and also some of these factors that are really helping people to see the benefits of their education. So the next slides, we've been talking here about prospective students, but this is something that we're seeing kind of across the board in our research with current students and alumni as well. So this was a survey of current students, and again, showing just the link between whether students have a support connecting education to a future career and whether they think their education will be worth the cost. So when students think that they have excellent support in connecting their education to their future career, then about 83% feel that their education is going to be worth the cost. And you can kind of see how if that's only, you know, fair or poor, that number really goes down. So these two concepts are very linked in the research that we're seeing. This is current students. For alumni, here, connection to career, we asked about a number of things, including internships, mentoring, career advising, and we really found a connection not just with these perceptions, like we've been talking about for prospective students and current students, but with outcomes that alumni experience. So if alumni had strong connections like internships and mentoring and things like that, they're much more likely to be earning at least a 20% income over high school. That's where we put that income, at least 40,000. So they're earning more money. They're more likely to say that their education was worth the cost, looking back. And they're much more likely to say that their education helped them to achieve their goals. So again, these, connecting education to career in a tight way is really linked to all these metrics of success for alumni. And finally, zeroing in just on one aspect of that, work-based learning was our last public viewpoint webinar in March. If you're interested, you can go back and see the full report on that. We took a look at outcomes for bachelor's degree recipients who had participated in work-based learning. And we found that they were earning more money, on average about 14,000 more than those who hadn't participated when you matched for race, ethnicity, gender, age, and field of study. They're more likely to say they're satisfied in their career. They're more likely to say their education was worth the cost. And they're much more likely to say that their education helped them to achieve their goals. So again, we see the importance not just of eliminating barriers, but also of looking beyond just enrollment and completion to what are you providing for learners upon that completion? Where can they go next? Because that's what prospective learners are thinking about. So just to kind of sum up, and then we'll get to our panelists, which I'm very excited for, kind of the key points here. So over the past 2 years, we've seen confidence in the value of education, whether it's going to be worth the cost and help people in their careers, has been declining. We've seen that the people who are most likely to say they will enroll are young people, Black respondents, and those who've attended some college but haven't completed a degree. So these are probably populations where there's great opportunity to enroll, and also we need to think about who's missing there and how can we maybe help those older respondents as well. We see that both expectations about enrollment, but also perceptions about the value of education, both predict the actual enrollment behavior that we see. We see that students identify some functional factors like flexible scheduling, credit for prior learning, and financial aid as the most likely means to increase the probability that they're going to enroll. But then we also see the importance of connections between education and career. So when students have those strong supports, such as work-based learning experiences, then we see prospective students are more likely to enroll and be confident. Current students are more likely to feel their education is going to be worth it, and then alumni report better outcomes. All right, so that's our data for today, and then Paul's going to go ahead and kick off our discussion.
Thanks for that, Nicole. I know you're going to stick around to contribute to the conversation, but before I let you off the hook, we've already started getting a bunch of questions. Thank you all. And I should say, by the way, we're going to leave time for folks to ask questions at the end, but we in the panel and folks with Strada can try to answer them as they come in, so keep them coming. But Nicole, we had several questions about whether or not the Strada data can be broken out by age group in terms of perceptions of higher ed, intent to enroll. Anything there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did a little bit of that, and we do see, unsurprisingly, that younger people are more likely to enroll. We looked all the way up to age 34 just because, the smaller you cut the age group, the smaller is the sample size. But again, even more likely, if you look at 18 to 24, more likely to enroll than people the next group. So it's kind of predictable in that way. I think it would be interesting to kind of match that up with the clearinghouse data in terms of how enrollment's been fluctuating and then how we've been following age groups over time. I think that that's a good opportunity for maybe some future exploration.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, so let's get into it. Andrea, I want to start with you. Just a broad question, your top line thoughts about some of the factors driving this enrollment crisis and really your work on how higher ed can best adjust to better serve students. Take it away, please.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. And thanks so much for that great presentation, Nicole, and to my panelists for joining today. I mean, everyone's joining today. I think so, based on the work that I do at APLU, it really is about scaling. So the work that we do in terms of small interventions at institutions is not just one institution, but looking more across, whether it be a Portland State University or Florida National University, it sits different. But I think understanding that the crisis isn't a present day crisis, right? I think this has been an ongoing issue and challenge. I think it's exacerbated because of the pandemic, because of what's happening in the workforce and how we're seeing it and how institutions are looking to respond. It's like we have interventions in place, but we need to adapt to what's happening now and think strategically about what that looks like for the future. Because how we're understanding learners isn't only or shouldn't only be exclusive to those learners coming straight out of high school. If we're thinking about the stop out learners and non-traditional learners, those are also first gen, single parent, undocumented learners. These are all learners that we need to think strategically about what does it mean to build equitable pathways and opportunities for them to actually see the value of higher education. And we see that, Nicole, you touched on that with respect to the workforce piece, like that clear connection that tells the learner, you earn this credential, there's a job that looks like this for you afterwards. That's where there's a big connection. There's that 83% that we saw earlier today. So those are just my initial thoughts based on the work that I do with APLU, Paul.
Thanks for that. Let's turn to Dominic. I'd love to hear what your take on this is. And really just to put a point on it, if you're seeing the same doubts about the value of college or folks not understanding the value.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again, Nicole, for that wonderful presentation. My initial reaction is mixed in that I work with a population of students who, many of whom are optimistic about learning or coming to school or the opportunities associated with that. And I think the research kind of bore that out for a big part of my population. However, it's a diverse population. So one segment understands that education has transformed the trajectory for folks from communities like theirs. So there's a high value on it. But education is extremely expensive and it's cumbersome. It's difficult to get a degree from institutions when you're coming from first generation, low income, historically underrepresented backgrounds. So sometimes there are segments of the population who believe that it's a pathway, but understand it's a daunting pathway. And when they land at institutions that don't have adequate support and do not recognize the unique needs that they have to create an equitable educational pathway, I think that's where you can see that doubt cropping up. You can see, and it's not just doubt. I don't want to downplay it. You can see the lived experience of how difficult that is and how that can lower their regard for the experience and impact those younger siblings and those community members who are coming after them because they see it as really a struggle. That said, I think I also work with a group of folks who have landed at institutions where there are resources available if you can navigate the pathway. So I think that at an institution like mine, we have good outcomes for students from those backgrounds when they're willing to connect with the resources and when we can convince them that we are trusted allies. I just was on a talk this morning with staff members from the Chicago Public Schools who are sending the next group of students. And part of the work that we did was just to build the connections in the pipelines. Here they're trusted advocates to connect with our trusted advocates there so we can steer them in a path that gives them the kind of support that they'll need to build success from the beginning. So all that to say, I see the findings of the research borne out across our diverse population. But depending on who you are and what your experience is, it hits different parts of those findings. There are those who doubt, there are those who are optimistic, there are those who are struggling, but if they can find institutions with the correct kind of support and the interest in making sure that they have a successful and robust college experience, I think there's still hope.
Thanks to Dominic. Deborah, obviously you've worked for a long time with community colleges that have taken it the hardest. Can you give you a sense of your take on how severe this problem is and really what we should be doing about it?
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be with everybody today. Thanks for the great research, Nicole, and the panel. As I listen, I agree that this is sort of a, immediate need, but it has been emerging for quite a long time. We've seen declines in enrollment in the community college sector, sort of more gradual until the pandemic, and then this really serious decline that you're showing us, Nicole. One of the things I think about community colleges generally are enrolling our most underserved populations with the least resources. So they are the most constrained in terms of the dollars to serve students. Therefore, they also don't have some of the services that you talked about, Dominic. Their institutions can vary by a great deal. So where we see some of the students who are leaving and some of the students have the least opportunity because of cost are students who are attending institutions that themselves are also constrained. I also want to point out too, that while we're seeing kind of the fleeing or certainly not the return to higher education that we hope, we've also seen a tremendous turnover of faculty and staff. The institutions themselves and who attends and who teaches and who serves students has undergone a tremendous turnover in the last couple of years through the pandemic. So it's really important we're talking about students, and I always commend Strada for giving us data we just don't find other places. So thank you for your student-focused work. But remember, this pandemic has hit higher education and community colleges particularly hard, including their own faculty and staff and leadership.
So a lot of points about resources, obviously very important here. The SHIO, the State Higher Education Officers Group, put out their state funding survey yesterday. And I was kind of surprised to see that support for community colleges was up relative to 4 years. And if you add in the local funding, it's actually as much per student, which 4 years, which kind of blew me away, but still not enough, obviously, to provide the sort of supports that hard stretched students with family obligations need. Given that, I mean, we know that the Biden administration proposed a huge amount of money for completion. It didn't happen. How much is the resource challenge key to turning this around? I know we're going to get to some tough love for higher ed itself beyond resources, but Dominic, can you start there? To me, it seems like it's always about resources.
So let me start by acknowledging I'm at an institution that has a significant amount of privilege. We are a large public flagship institution, and there are resources there. However, I work with a population that actually doesn't feel the full support that you would expect from an institution like ours. Many of my students are first generation, many are low income, many are historically underrepresented, many are navigating this space without the support that you would expect. They work too much. They are trying to balance family obligations. The pandemic has been devastating in that when those students were pulled out to go home, they lost access to education. Their ability to navigate or have the online technical support to be in these hybrid courses was compromised. The family's need for them to be childcare and be employed and to be supporting took them away from their studies in a way that compromised their ability to make progress. And that's at an institution with an embarrassment of resources. We were able to give grants, we were able to give hotspots, we were able to give out computers. And even in that context, we had students who struggled. Even as we make the transition back, there are students who were not able to transition back with us because families were devastated financially. And that happened over and over again in the population that I serve. So the idea that researchers are, the question that is, are resources critical? Are they that important? The answer is a resounding yes. This is a perfect place to make an investment in terms of providing the student support resources, the financial aid, the institutional flexibility. And let me just say, the pandemic also taught us that the kind of academic flexibility that the institution has an opportunity to make, they have just chosen not to. We did things that we've never done in 30 years to figure out how to make the environment survivable for students. And if we use that initiative and incorporate that kind of flexibility, we can continue to support more students equitably to graduation. So again, I underscore resources, absolutely, financial resources, but also policy resources and using flexibility that we can leverage to make sure that students have a pathway to success. That can be done.
Thank you. Andrea, I want to give you a kind of shade of that question from the audience that was aimed at you. You know, your members, land grants, many of them also financially strapped. How prepared are they to serve non-traditional learners versus traditional ones? And how important is the resource question to that?
Yeah, so part of my work at APLU is I work with a specific subset of institutions under the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities, and they're considered urban serving because of where they sit in the community. So they're anchors to the community, and the communities are underserved, minoritized populations and groups. So they are not only institutions of higher learning, but they are also institutions of medical centers, places where families can learn like English as a second language, opportunities for free legal services. So the responsibility and the commitment to their stakeholders, the stakeholders are not exclusive to the student, staff, and faculty. It's inclusive of the community where they serve. So given the resources and what's happened with the pandemic, I think the resources, how we understand resources, shouldn't be exclusive to how the equal way that it's distributed to every learner, because every learner's need looks very different, right? And that's sort of the intersectionality of every learner coming thing. So a Black first gen, Latino, Latinx, undocumented single parent learner is not going to need the same type of resource that a white male coming in from high school is going to need, right? So I think understanding the difference between learner, understanding how resources play a big part in building coalition for the learners to be able to move through the educational pathway the way that he, she, or they should be able to. But also to Dominic's point, it's just, we didn't know what we didn't know. And by we, I'm talking about higher education, right? We're inherently reactive, we're not proactive. I think we think after, but that's just based on how we function as an enterprise. And I think our institutions were somewhat set up and they had the infrastructure, but a lot of it really took for them to transform, right? So the idea of institutional transformation and how that feeds into their role as agents to be better set up for their communities and their learners. So I think a big part of it, back to your point, Paul, it's your question, and like the resources do play a big part in it, but understanding how to use it equitably and understanding how the business model and the ROI in terms of the institution plays a big role, and how they funnel the resources to also plays a big role, and how the learner feels, do I feel connected to this institution to return or even enroll? And those are the things that our institutions are still navigating through.
Great points. Debra, about a dozen years ago, I wrote a series of articles for Inside Higher Ed about prior learning assessment having a moment. I was wrong about that. It didn't really happen. It goes against the business model for a lot of reasons we all know. Those numbers are pretty stunning, frankly, how high students placed PLA. I get it, but were you surprised by that? And how can we make some progress there?
I was surprised by that. I'd be really interested in knowing exactly how that question was asked, because when I research, the perspectives of faculty and staff and administrators in higher ed, they don't know what credit for prior learning or prior learning assessment means. So, I wondered what the students thought that meant. My guess is it has to do about increasing credit mobility, valuing credits that students can attain through various modalities of learning, which I think is incredibly important. But, if we struggle doing some of the basic kind of changes that we know need to happen, like scheduling, flexible scheduling, talk about doing something more complicated. That is innovations that change, require that we think differently about the business model. So, having studied this various portfolio of interventions that we're talking about, prior learning assessment and credit for prior learning are some of the more complex and some of the ones that we still struggle to see institutions implementing. So, I kind of share your skepticism, Paul, I think, but maybe some progress is being made. And I do think it needs to be done, rigorously, but I do think it can be done, and we need to move faster to acknowledge that knowledge that particular underserved working learners are bringing to our campuses.
Quickly, Nicole, anything you can add in terms of that question on prior learning assessment and how students were apprised of what that means?
Yeah, I mean, I know that just kind of the branding of it itself, as Debra said, has been kind of an issue. I think, one of our researchers at Strada did some work on this and talking about just how would you communicate that with students so they even understand what it means, maybe use the words credit for prior learning instead of prior learning assessment, and how to actually, it's one thing to have it in theory, it's another thing in practice. If you're someone, say, coming out of the military and you have those kinds of skills and experiences, do you know how to go on your campus and actually, do you even know that that's a possibility to ask for credit for that, or, much less how to translate that? So yeah, I think awareness is a huge issue for, a lot of these policies. You can have them on paper, but, if students aren't taking advantage of the resources, whether it's a career services center or whether it's credit for prior learning, a big part is how to actually engage with the students that need these services.
And if I could add a thought
Please.
right there, it's also, in part of my life, I used to oversee our veteran student support services. And a comment that you made, Nicole, really triggered a memory, and that is that even when students know to ask and are very clear on the kind of expertise they bring, sometimes the hurdles at the institution are so high in the name of rigor, in the name of how the courses need to match up, that they found it too daunting to navigate. I mean, we had students come in with amazing amount of skill and ability and years of experience that the institution, frankly, couldn't figure out what to do with. So I think it's a question not only of raising awareness for student, but creating more will, a larger appetite to be more accepting of that prior learning.
Well, Dominic, I want to stick with you and then turn to Andrea on this kind of big question of, like, this is a serious crisis. Other R1s besides Illinois, I think, are probably going to be but you've got this cascade effect of institutions admitting students from institutions kind of a rung below them in selectivity, and it's just going to ripple across higher ed. Maybe it'll turn around, but we've got a projected drop off in enrollment in a couple of years because of birth rates after the recession. Where are we in terms of acceptance in higher ed that you really have to transform how you do business, how you serve students?
That's loaded, and you're trying to get me in trouble, Andrew. But here's what I'll say to it. I started my career in admissions. And when we started, we would show up and we invited students to Illinois. I think those days have long passed. We, all of us, must recruit. And part of that is understanding the unique needs of the population and bending the institution, making room to accept those students who are coming in with prior learning, those students who are non-traditional, those students who have not looked like the students that we've served. And frankly, some of us are in a bit of a bubble. It's tough to feel the dire need for that when your institution hits a record enrollment last year, right? I mean, we see the overall decline that's happening across, but there are bubbles. And some of those bubbles are at these schools that are in the Big Ten. I mean, we weren't the only one that experienced an enrollment surge in areas. And though we are aware of the data, and though we are working with high schools, and we see that in some ways we're already over the cliff in terms of the enrollment drop off. We're in free fall, but we haven't really felt the full impact of it. And for those of us who are not making changes now, we are going to be rudely awakened, because what we see in the decline is going to impact all of us. But the urgency around it needs to be taken more seriously by many of our institutions. And I know that my institution is working that way, but I think that we could do it more urgently, particularly when I'm working with a subset of students who will become a larger portion of our population. Our first generation population is growing. Our students from low income backgrounds, those populations have grown. When I look at the students who are eligible for my services, it's 30 to 40% of all students, and we have 56,000 of them. I mean, my services are as large as our largest college, and that has been growing over time. So to your point, I think it is critical that we take a step back and proactively look at how we meet tomorrow's students today, because they're here.
Thank you. So Andrea, it is a bit of a loaded question, but let me start out with APLU sincerely has been pretty aggressive on this issue for a long time. From my kind of skeptical journalistic position, you all have been taking this seriously, but where do you see the field right now after those spring enrollment numbers?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I definitely need to do a shameless plug here, because we did launch the free open access course titled Principles of Institutional Transformation. It's based on a 6-year-long project that's funded through the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation on helping institutions change, accelerate change, right? And I think there was a comment in the chat that I saw. It was like, higher ed refuses to change. There's a yes and no to that. I think many institutions don't know where to start with respect to having to change, right? I think that's a big piece of it. And Dominic, I also started in admissions, and it's very interesting. My sort of task was like, okay, Andrea, we need to increase the Latino, Latina, Latinx numbers by so forth. And I said, okay, so I'm a first-gen Latina graduate, so I know my community. And I remember telling the admissions folks, I'm like, we have nothing in English and Spanish. Everything is mostly English, but you want me to go to the communities of mostly Latinos with nothing in Spanish? And I'm like, that's sort of the piece that still is happening today. It's like, if we're looking to recruit learners, we need to know who they are, their community, their backgrounds, and have an understanding of the value proposition that we're trying to market to them. Like, this is what higher education and we as an institution can do for you, right? And I think knowing how to transform is very different than being aware that you need to do that as an enterprise. And the ripple effect that the institution can have, that impact that can have on the learners. So that immediate connection between education and career is very critical. And that's why in the report, in the Strada report, there's mention of like the technical education has increased, because there's a clear line between, I get this degree in construction or this credential in construction, then I can get this job in construction, and this is how much money I can make. that connection needs to be made earlier on versus having to wait until their third or fourth year in college, when then they're asking students like, come to the career offices. And that's another part of it too, that need to transform in how we're using employers. It shouldn't only be a recruitment part, but they should be integrative into how we're understanding recruiting learners into the institutions, right? Rethinking, disrupting entire notion about like, let's bring employers into their classrooms. There are institutions who are doing that now instead of waiting until the very end. So I think COVID has really accelerated institutions being able to change, because at one point institutions said, we're not going to go online. That's never going to happen. We did it. And then that gives me hope that we can continue to change in support of our learners and communities, especially our underserved and minoritized ones.
Thank you for that. Debra, I think it's safe to say that community college students in particular often lack the sort of advising resources that apprise them of opportunities in the labor market and how to structure their studies, even to explore careers early in their journey. Any points of light you're seeing out there in the sector, whether it's institutions, systems, or states that are trying to get more useful information on careers into students' hands?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I think that this whole area has been evolving, and a lot of effort is being made in community colleges to better advise students. All the work on pathways, career pathways, and guided pathways focuses on connecting students, very early to think about, where they really want to go. And I feel like that's an area that probably community colleges have done more work and maybe are farther ahead than the rest of our, the rest of higher education system. But I do have to say that the panel is so interesting because of our different perspectives. And I always feel like higher education really mirrors society. And so when we're talking about institutions that have survived and thrived through the pandemic, while others, have lost tremendous enrollment, and really suffered through this period, it's, I think we have to own the fact in higher education that we are reflecting society. And if we want that to change, then we do have to innovate faster. We do have to make more changes. And I think community colleges across the country are attempting to do that, but it is challenging. It's challenging work.
Dominic,
if I can offer, there's also a danger here. The pandemic accelerated change. There's no doubt about that. But as we're moving back into a hybrid or near normal environment, we're also losing some of that innovation. Some people, the goal is to get back to the way it was, as opposed to incorporate what we have learned and to continue moving forward. So this is a crossroads to figure out whether or not we will maintain some of the momentum and push forward, or we will decide to slow down and do the thing that we often do. I hope that we make the decision to continue to push forward, because we have to be prepared for the demands that our new students and our continuing students are bringing forward. It's really a critically important point to make some decisions about how much will we have to embrace transformation.
I want to ask Andrea on that. Just to me, I'm not seeing the folks in my reporting who say, oh, we're good. We got past that pandemic and everything's going back to the way it was. I'm not seeing that. And that goes up to highly selective institutions. But where are you on a kind of continuing to harness the energy to change, or, well, we've got other things right now to focus on?
No, I think, Dominic, I was not in my head, because I do hear that same sort of disclaimer, like it's what we know how to do it. This is how we know how to do it, and we're sticking to what we know. But I think a big part of the work and challenging the institutions is like, it's clear that you can do it. We can tackle these challenges and look at inequitable policies, right? We're talking about closing the equity gaps. Well, what's contributing to that, and how are we perpetuating those equity gaps we're trying to dismantle, right? Given all that and what they've developed, the institutions, we're informing them and guiding them in how to sustain that, because that's a big piece of that. It's the sustainability and being able to do that. And that's also, we know that's very much tied to resources. You know, a lot of institutions, the HBCUs, the HSIs, or the tribal colleges, they may not be fully resourced, and the community colleges extremely under-resourced. But given that, if they're trying to build coalition and market to learners that there is the value proposition into entering higher education, and that immediate demonstration that like, this is the return on investment for you as a learner, and being learner-centered, human-centered first, then institution first, I think we can see the switch happening. And some institutions are slowly moving to that, but we know higher education, it does take a very long time to change. But that sustainability piece, and then moving into the scalability piece, that will be critical to actually demonstrate, can the institutions, can higher education actually change and transform and address this pandemic, I would say, of the decline in enrollment. So I'm hopeful, I would say, in what they're doing and the interventions that they're scaling and sustaining that work, and that partnership with employers, and the partnership with the community colleges are also very important to moving us forward.
Nicole, I wanted to bring you in on any of these points, but also if you wanted to highlight career connections that Strada is seeing institutions make.
Yeah, there's so much. And so, you know, like Andrea, we're hopeful that, you know, we are seeing bright spots. I mean, some of the interesting things that we're seeing more institutions trying to figure out ways that they can make those career connections no matter what a student is studying. So, you know, it's easy to say like, okay, if you're studying even something like engineering, okay, that's a very applied field. And so we can see that direct connection. But if you want to study the arts, or you want to study English or history, how do we make sure that those students also have those connected experiences? And so we're seeing some really interesting things there with employer partnerships, again, so students getting to do project-based hands-on learning with employers in some of those fields, or students getting to earn maybe an industry credential on top of a degree that might be, say, in English or history, and then you add on, you know, some other kind of technical credential, and with the combination of both the human skills and the technical skills, that can really give them a launching pad for a career. So some of those are the most innovative. You know, we're seeing a lot of increasing awareness of the importance of internships, and then how to make those opportunities equitably available. So how do you make sure to subsidize so that they're paid for every student, and, you know, figuring out how to work with any kind of financial aid barriers that, you know, might be in place for students taking summer internships, things like that. So I do think that there's an appetite, as Debra said, you know, there's such diversity across types of institutions, and some may be feeling the urgency more so than others, or some subsets, you know, sections of universities, you know, some student populations are going to be feeling that sooner than others, but we're just excited to see the innovations that are taking place so that we can then learn from them to scale it up for more students.
So I'm going to be answering as many, or having throwing questions from you all to the panel here for the remaining minutes. Dominic, I see one about the need to link tenure and promotion policies for faculty to these important innovations, particularly at flagship publics. Are we seeing some of that? Should we? Can we?
I don't want to talk out of turn. That it's a little out of my lane. I'm deep in student support services, but I think it's an amazing idea. I mean, folks are thinking about accountability in a lot of different ways. You know, linking the kind of transformation you want to see curricularly to tenure and promotion. Legislators are looking at the changes that they want to see and tying that to funding. You know, there's either a stick or a carrot. You know, you find a way to help change happen. But I would say, as we're thinking about making good on the idea of transformation, there have to be some kind of accountability system. I would prefer incentives. I think that people respond well to that, but I like accountability as well. I use them both in my management, so I think it's a good idea.
Thanks for that. Deborah, let's stick on the policy piece a bit here. Obviously a broad topic, but any key accountability or incentives or both that you'd like to see at the state or federal level to help with this crisis?
Well, I was just reading a new blog that from today from the Institute for Education Sciences talking about improvements that have been made in iPads and the shift that's being made to better report student outcomes and use that as the norm as opposed to sort of our old systems of data collection. If we're going to really change how we view higher education and what higher education does, we have to really improve the data systems that we have so that we know and have confidence that we know what's happening to our students. So there's a lot that I could say there, but it struck me as really important timing this morning, reading an interesting blog about how progress is made, but so much more needs to be done to improve our data systems to report what's happening in higher education and hold higher education accountable.
Obviously, better data coming online, but a lot of progress left to go. Yeah. Andrea, any top policy priorities or concepts you want to flag here?
Definitely institutional transformation. So I didn't mention that, but I think a lot of when we talk about pathways, that word is thrown a lot around. So I think that the idea of pathways and what that means for the institution, for the learner, for the community, for the employers as well. And at what stage do we bring on stakeholders? Because I think it's higher education, how we function with it. It's very much, we know this and we are going to assume we know what the learners want, right? And I think it's changing that mindset that can really help us sort of disrupt the policy making that we're so used to making and developing based on our assumptions, based on data points that are important, but don't tell the full story of every learner that we're trying to reach.
You mentioned employers. Deborah, I know that community colleges often feel burned when they're asked to create programs that are responsive to the labor market, that the employers don't hire sometimes for those new programs. Are you seeing increased and useful employer engagement on some of the issues we've discussed?
I do think we're seeing progress on colleges working more closely with employers from the beginning, before a program is designed, before resources are committed. It really has to be a partnership. So I do think that we, there's pretty large federal investments going back a decade, and some of those have taken hold. And I would say, I think we are making progress, though obviously more could be done and done better.
Nicole, we're just about at time. Any last thoughts particular to the employer piece?
Yeah, well, we're launching a new, we have increased interest in some of these community college employer partnerships. And so we'll be, supporting some of those partnerships going forward. And I think that's a really critical piece, especially when we're talking about sustainability. And someone had a good question in the chat about how to pay for a lot of these initiatives. And I think that it is appropriate to, see where it makes sense for employers to have some skin in the game when it comes to, these training the future workforce.
Dominic, I'm going to give you 1 minute here to give us our last parting thought, to give us something hopeful to take away, maybe.
Okay, me for hope. Here is my hope. As we're thinking about transformation, I would be remiss if not taking that idea and applying it to the student experience. A lot of what will transform us is making sure that we are attuned to what our students want and what they need. And as we think about the flexibility in scheduling and policy, I think we also need to tend to culture and climate on our institutions. That continues to be a sticking point for students, and also to think about how we support the life needs. Students come as whole, complete people, and the bottom line is we find students who are still struggling with food insecurity and housing insecurity and how to take care of their full life as they are progressing. So I think if we approach this problem looking to make partnerships with our students, with our K through 12, with our employers, we will get further faster. And to be okay with embracing change and transformation. A lot of our stagnation is about lack of will, not lack of knowledge.
Thanks for that, Dominic. Thanks to all of you panelists for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. I believe we're going to email you the slide deck and the recording, or Strada will be soon. So that is it. We ran out of time. Thanks for being here. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.